the newsagents.
Who should Labour supporters vote for in Rochdale, then?
The voters in Rochdale will have to determine who they vote for, but I'm not prepared to put forward a Labour candidate unless I think that candidate is fit to be a Labour MP.
That was Keir Starmer, unable to support the Labour candidate in what was formerly a safe Labour seat of Rochdale in Lancashire. If you're a voter in Rochdale, you have the choice of someone who was kicked out of the Labour Party 20 years ago, someone who was kicked out of the Labour Party 7 years ago, someone who was kicked out of the Labour Party yesterday, and a host of others now. What on earth is going on in the race to be the next Rochdale MP, and how will it affect Starmer's leadership?
This is shaping up to be the weirdest, most unusual, most volatile or unpredictable by-election that we've seen in years, possibly in modern history. On today's show, we're going to take you through it and ask how it's going to shape the much bigger political contest to come.
Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And later we'll be looking at that imminent, impending offensive, deeply feared by Palestinians in Rafah, who have been told once again to move to save their lives from an Israeli invasion there, as Israel continues its hunt for Hamas terrorists.
But first we're going to talk about Rochdale, where Labour had their candidate. They were going ahead perfectly well after the sad death of Sir Tony Lloyd, who'd been the MP there for many years. They picked their candidate. Mail on Sunday story, which says this guy has used an anti-Semitic trope. Labour Party says yesterday, yes, it was an anti-Semitic trope, but he's apologised for it and he just fell for a conspiracy theory. A few hours later, more material comes out, which is even worse, leaked audio, and Labour decides, after all of that rigmarole, Keir Starmer basically says, we're not going to support this guy anymore, Azhar Ali, who had been our candidate. And so we are in this deeply, deeply weird position.
Yeah.
Where there's a Labour candidate, but he's not the Labour candidate.
You have to feel for the good people, the poor people of Rochdale at this point, because on their slate, with around, 16 candidates, they have the guy who was thrown out of the Labour Party nearly 2 decades ago, against the guy who was thrown out of the Labour Party about 7 years ago, facing another guy who was thrown out of the Labour Party 24 hours ago. There are other candidates should you choose, including, let's say, the monster raving loony party, who's now looking at possibly the most sane choice of all.
Count Bimface really missed a trick by not standing in this one. Honestly.
Right? So you have got all these sort of ex-Labour ghosts and a Labour leader saying, please don't vote for the guy who's got the red rosette by his name. Just don't vote for him. He might win anyway. Any of the others might win anyway. And none of them has the endorsement of the Labour Party itself, in a part of the world which has really, really struggled politically in recent years to actually a place that has really been, I think we can say, underserved by its politicians in recent years. The people of Rochdale have had a terrible time over recent years and have felt quite cut adrift by some of the scandals that have rocked that particular constituency.
So obviously the question has been how Keir Starmer was going to handle it, how he was going to justify it, having had a day yesterday where the line was, as I said, that this guy, yes, he may be a conspiracy theorist, but he's our guy. He's
our conspiracy theorist.
He's still our guy. Yeah. To move to a position where actually he's just a conspiracy theorist. He still happens to have the Labour logo, the Labour rose next to his name on the ballot paper because, of course, those ballot papers are there and cannot be unprinted, and by electoral law, they can't change the candidate. Obviously, awful 24, 48, 72 hours for Starmer. This is how he justified it this afternoon.
Certain information came to light over the weekend in relation to the candidate. There was a fulsome apology. Further information came to light yesterday calling for decisive action. So I took decisive action. It is a huge thing to withdraw support for a Labour candidate during the course of a by-election. It's a tough decision, a necessary decision. But when I say the Labour Party has changed under my leadership, I mean it.
If it has changed, will you then be investigating the other councillors who also joined in with that discussion that were recorded when Mr Ali made those comments in October?
Well, those comments were appalling and that is why we took decisive action. It is virtually unprecedented to withdraw support for a candidate in the way that I withdrew support for this candidate yesterday. That's what a changed Labour Party is all about. And of course, any allegation will be fully investigated by the party. But the important thing is the decisive action that's been taken to make it absolutely clear that this is a changed Labour Party.
You didn't actually answer that question, though. There were other councillors who were Labour councillors in that room joining in with that conversation. Will they too be investigated?
Any allegation that needs to be investigated will be investigated.
And Martin Ford has said that there's a perception that anti-Semitism is being weaponised along factional lines. Do you accept that you have handled previous cases of anti-Semitism allegations in your party differently to the way in which you addressed this case? And aren't you guilty of double standards?
I set out 4 years ago to tear anti-Semitism out of the Labour Party. It's the first thing I said I'd do as Labour leader, and to change our party. I've taken a series of decisions along those lines, ruthlessly changing our party, and it's made no difference to me where somebody stands in the Labour Party. The change I brought about is a Labour Party that is now back in the service of working people.
Decisive action, Emily. You will have noticed very decisive action. Decisive action.
I love taking decisive action.
72
over
hours
the
after
course
the
of
fact.
Many days.
Yeah.
And many editorials. Look, there is every chance that Azhar Ali could still win that seat for Labour. Well, not for Labour, but for whatever, for him. But there is also the chance that the guy who was kicked out of the party 20 years ago, one George Galloway, who is probably the person that Labour is most fearful of in this entire race, could take the seat. George Galloway has been a thorn in Labour's side ever since he took on Tony Blair over the Iraq War in 2004, stood against a Labour MP in Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005, and indeed years later was getting fired from his job at Talk Radio for anti-Semitic comments about a Spurs football match. So you have got this extraordinary situation where the people of Rochdale are not really getting anything that looks like a traditional Labour candidate right now that their leader supports.
Yeah, so we should talk a little bit about kind of where this leaves the contest itself, which is that, as we've said, there are these sort of three ex-Labour candidates, no official Labour candidate, and what could the outcomes be? Well, the outcomes could be, and we shouldn't underestimate this possibility, that Mr. Ali could actually still win. Because he remains, I mean, we can overestimate the extent to which your average voter in Rochdale or anywhere else will have even noticed or heard any of this stuff. Yep. This is, in lots of ways, although the issues are important, it is one of those issues that requires a little bit of attention, a fair bit of focus. Most people, Emily, you've covered them, I've covered lots of them, most people in any by-election often don't even know that it's happening. Like, they don't even know that a by-election is happening. They might not even know what a by-election is. And so it is entirely possible that the people who turn up, in terms of, and it's always a lower turnout on a by-election, they turn out, they see Mr. Ali's name, it's next to the Labour box, and they still tick him, so he could then win. What the Labour Party has then said is that he will then come to Parliament, but he will automatically be an independent MP, so presumably that means that Labour have a new candidate in place for the general election in just a few months' time. So Ali's time as an MP is very limited. The other two, or the other option, or the other main beneficiaries, it seems to me, of this, the main one you've already mentioned, Emily, is Galloway, because Galloway is probably, whatever you think about him, and there's a lot to say about him, he is probably the most effective kind of political street fighter, the most effective constituency campaigner that we've seen in modern politics for the last 25 years or so. His ability to basically corral a movement, pretty much based on Muslim voters or a particular type of Muslim voter in any given constituency in certain types of seats, has been second to none. As you were saying, he was a Labour MP, he left the party, he ended up running basically an anti-Blair, anti-Iraq war ticket in the years after the Iraq war. He famously won the 2005, in the 2005 general election, he won the Bethnal Green and Bow constituency, very big Muslim population. He then left Parliament, fought another seat, lost, famously won in Bradford in a by-election in 2012, again another constituency with a big Muslim population, And then since then he's fought a number of seats, including Batley and Spen, and now he has the opportunity to pull off the same trick again. And it could not be a moment which is better primed for him, because obviously the geopolitical situation is such with the war in Gaza that he has something to run on, and this fiasco within the Labour Party opens the door for him, which is precisely the reason, I suspect, why the Labour Party was so reluctant to disavow Mr Ali in the first place, because it risked letting Galloway in.
Yeah, and if Galloway is a name that you've heard without necessarily having a face or a figure or a political background to put to him, let us take you right back to the mid-90s when George Galloway set himself up as the friend of, the advocate of Saddam Hussein in the years before Tony Blair had invaded Iraq. He went to pay his respects and his tributes to him in the palace in Baghdad. Just have a listen.
Sir, I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability. I can honestly tell you that there was not a single person to whom I told I was coming to Iraq and hoping to meet with yourself who did not wish me to convey their heartfelt, fraternal greetings and support.
Now, I think it's worth saying, in a sense, to qualify what you said, Lewis, which is he's an incredibly effective campaigner. He is an early populist. He is to the left, maybe what Farage is to the right, except with electoral success under his belt, but very much in niche contexts. And I think that is quite important to understand. Yes, he plays to a predominantly Muslim voter in a specific kind of seat where thoughts of the Iraq war still play large, where the plight of Gazans and Palestinians will massively motivate people to vote. In that sense, yes, the timing of now is absolutely spot on. He has been a friend of Putin. He has tweeted his support for him. So I think there is a sense in which Galloway knows his crowd. He plays to a very specific crowd. 3 years ago, you'll remember this, Liz, because I think you were there, he nearly won in Batley and Spen. This was the seat of the murdered MP Joe Cox, whose sister actually was the eventual victor. But he was running a campaign where he was accused of homophobia, I think, in that one. And he still secured 22% of the vote. I mean, he gained many Muslim supporters. And I think that Kim Leadbeater only won by about 300 votes in that situation. So he knows he's very, very targeted about the seats in which he chooses to stand and the platform on which he stands. I mean, I should also say that for a man who has campaigned relentlessly and rigorously on poverty in the past, a photo was sent to me today where an advert that he's put out for his party, the Workers' Party, is now actually, I think, paying below the minimum wage for a campaign intern at £10.42 per hour. This clearly less troubling to the Galloway now than the one of old.
Yeah, you're right. I've seen him campaign up close. Like I say, he is an effective kind of street fighter in a by-election in particular, because he's very, very good at basically getting people like us to pay him attention. He does stunts. He has a big bus that he used. I remember covering him in the Manchester Gorton by-election, which never actually happened because the general election came along to interrupt it. But, he has a big bus with a picture of Tony Blair covered by explosions, big Blair sort of plastered along the side.
Proper populism stuff.
Yeah, completely.
Right?
And a populism sort of, as you say, Emily, targeted at a particular section of the population. And all of the stars do seem to be aligning for him here. What he also has, as a result of being so embedded in a section of the Muslim community and sort of British Muslim politics, again, just a section, you can't generalise too much, is he does have a very strong support network and a very strong campaigning base that will follow him around wherever he happens to be standing. I saw that in Batley and Spen, as you say, back in 2021, and I asked him about what his position was with regards to the Labour Party at that time, and he has as you know, a pretty bellicose style, which was on display then.
I'm standing here, putting myself up for election, and we'll see how the people respond. And I think you're going to get, for you, a very unpleasant surprise.
I couldn't care less whether you win or not, Mr. Galloway. You're the one who's saying that this is about working class people and about, I assume as well, Muslim voters. How will it help Muslim people in this constituency to have a Conservative Party MP with a Prime Minister who, in a recent report, was actually accused of displaying crassness towards the
why
Muslim
don't you ask-
community
why don't
as
you
a
ask
result
them?
of. I will ask them, and I have asked them, but I'm asking you how you think it will help
Well,
Muslim voters in this country about helping a Conservative MP get elected for a leader, a Prime Minister, who has talked about Muslim women looking like letterboxes.
Look, the people here, Muslim and non-Muslim, want a change. The political class doesn't represent them, doesn't speak for them, doesn't listen to them. Evidently, a significant number of people in this constituency think that I'd be a powerful voice for them.
Galloway then, as he is now, trying to capitalise on what Muslim voters want to hear. And yet I think it's worth putting Rochdale in a bit more context, because it is also a place of, I think, huge political disenchantment. I mean, some of our listeners will remember going right back to the Gordon Brown years in 2010 when he kind of made that awful gaffe in Rochdale at the home of one Gillian Duffy, who he subsequently was caught on mic calling a bigot over her views on immigration. This was, I guess, the start of where Labour was starting to lose its understanding, its sort of grassroots understanding of some of the people in Rochdale. And it's also a place that has had horrific child abuse scandals over recent years, horrific sexual crimes against girls there. And I think it's worth saying that the other person who is ex-Labour, who is also standing, but for the Reform Party, is Simon Danczuk. Now, he's the former Labour MP. He was suspended by the party in 2017 following reports that he sent explicit messages to a 17-year-old girl. He thinks of himself as the paedophile hunter-in-chief who really exposed the paedophilia of the former MP, Cyril Smith. Was he Sir Cyril Smith? I think he might have been Sir
Rochdale
Cyril
has
Smith.
had an amazing political history in all sorts of different ways. It's
Yeah,
extraordinary.
I mean, look, playing into this, obviously, it is a place with a lot of poverty. It's a place with a lot of unrest. This is a place where horrendous scandal has rubbed up against the community time and time again. And from that perspective, it is, I guess, right for exploitation from people who think that they can come in with a magic bullet and offer some kind of alternative version to whatever people have had in the last 20 years.
Yeah, it's a place which has had, in all sorts of ways, a difficult politics, and is, as you say, Emily, kind of almost primed for a by-election, particularly when you superimpose the kind of wider volatility and tension that's with regards to Gaza and the fact it's got, its population is 30% Muslim. It's a sort of potential as a constituency goes for being a bit of a powder keg. That said, of course, the most likely, and we've alluded to this, the most likely outcome probably with regards to all of this is for the local electorates is confusion. Yeah. It's confusion about who to vote for, about which candidate is really standing for whom, and so on. And probably in that context, when you already have a by-election which will always be lower turnout, it is in that context that you can see someone like Galloway being able to squeak through on 8,000 votes or 9,000 votes, because you already got a lower turnout to begin with. That's probably going to be depressed anyway, because Labour voters, higher information Labour voters, are going to be confused as to who they should vote for. And in that situation, Galloway comes through. I suppose we should sort of then ask, how much does it matter? Because, of course, we're talking about an MP who is going to be an MP for, at the very most, 7, 8 months or so? Yeah. Galloway, if he gets in, will use, as he always does, the kind of pulpit of the House of Commons to try and advance his agenda, to do social media clips, he will set himself up as the sort of voice of Palestine.
I mean, he's a very good orator. We should say that.
Yeah, he's
right?
probably the best orator of modern British politics, in fairness to him again. For all of the rabble-rousing that he does, for good or ill, he is that, and he will use the chamber in that way. But of course, in terms of, and it will be, we should say, it will be, if Labour lose that seat on February the 29th, it will be highly embarrassing for Labour. It will be highly embarrassing for Keir Starmer, because, rightly or wrongly, people will say that's partly as a result of how they handled it. They should have been better across who the candidate was going to be. Labour HQ have exercised a kind of iron discipline about the candidates. And yet, in this by-election, where candidates always receive more attention than a general, of course, because there's only one set of candidates as opposed to 650 constituencies, where the hell was the control about all of this? And it wasn't there. That said, if we look at the overall political situation and picture, it probably is just a bit more noise. I mean, I kind of feel like Labour at that point, I was talking to a Labour MP the other day who was saying, I would actually like Starmer to be more radical and more out there, But in a way, our biggest problem at the moment is that we've got a 20-point poll lead. It's our greatest advantage, but it basically insulates us from any problems. It reminds me of the period a bit like what the Tories were in like 2020, 21, 22 in the pandemic, when everyone kept going, surely this latest debacle will mean that Boris Johnson drops 5 points or 10 points. And it made no difference because the public had slightly tuned out. They'd already made up their mind about the politics of that period.
Look,
It feels the same to me with Labour now.
Yes and no. I think you can say that whatever happens in Rochdale probably won't be a long-term problem for Labour in the sense that, if Galloway gets it, he may then be replaced. He might not. I mean, he might, make his mark as an independent and go on in a general election to retain that seat. You don't know. I guess the wider question it throws up is, A, about Keir Starmer and whether he does, in fact, make decisive decisions. I mean, we heard in that clip his repetition of the word decisive, which came after a weekend in which he was anything but. He had dithered, he had wavered, he probably knew what course of events he should have taken. There were people saying to us yesterday, well, we don't know that there isn't more. Right? Yeah. And as it turns out, he should have been asking those questions.
Well,
is there more? Right. You only get one bit on one day and then you get the next bit on the next day. I think the wider question it points out is they will need to find many, many Labour candidates over the next 8 months. And how closely are they vetting everyone that stands in every seat, right? We've seen when you've got, reform candidates, and they sort of say, we've got 600 reform candidates, and, the fruitcakes and the loons come out, right? It does not just happen in one party. It can happen in any party. We've seen that. And I guess the question is, how closely will they be vetting everyone who's standing? How closely will they be investigating the Labour councillors who, as you've heard, were also in that room? Keir Starmer said, well, if I need to investigate them, I will. Well, who decides whether you do need to or not? I mean, that's for him to make that decision, right? So I guess there's a lot more jeopardy going into this now, knowing that they probably haven't sorted out every single candidate for every single seat, and this can happen again and again.
Well, that's what sort of slightly surprises me about this whole thing, because actually something that you talk to Labour people, they've been complaining about enormously is just the extent to which the sort of command and control from the centre, not only around candidates but around everything else, the factional control has been like something that even puts the New Labour period, which people used to say was monolithic, to absolute shame. So it is embarrassing for him, and if they lose the seat, it will be demoralising for the party. Going into the general election period, going into the local election period, it'll be demoralising for the activists, and it'll be embarrassing. As I say, I think longer term, it probably doesn't matter that much because I think the Labour Party's overall political position is strong. But it is true, as we were saying on the show yesterday, Starmer does have a Gaza problem. It's a problem at the grassroots of the Labour Party. Even if you just look at the Lancashire Labour Party, for example, they've had to, lots of councillors there have resigned. That's happening all over the country. We don't know how long this war is going to go on for. It does pose a problem for not only his period now as leader of the opposition, but potentially if he becomes the Prime Minister as well. But all of that said, at the end of this week at least, it isn't going to be the by-election we're going to be talking about, because we're going to be talking about two by-elections. Rishi Sunak's got his own by-election problems, which is, of course, the by-elections taking place in Wellingborough and in Kingswood, both of which he's expected to lose, and that will be the story of the end of the week.
So for the last week, Israel's government, Israel's Prime Minister, has been talking about a ground offensive in the southernmost part of Gaza, Rafah. And this is a place that originally Israel had told Palestinians, Gazans, to move to avoid airstrikes in the north of the Strip. And now they're saying that a ground incursion could flatten Rafah and people have got to leave. The question is, where on earth would they go? Why should they move again? How many times can the same people be displaced or wounded or killed as the Israeli incursion continues?
Yeah, and we should say that there is already a humanitarian crisis in Rafah, just like there is in the rest of Gaza, and that is before any Israeli incursion becomes more intense still. This is something that has been animating the Biden administration, who don't want this to happen and yet seem unable or unwilling to realise the leverage they have to prevent it from happening. And it is something that is of increasing concern to the UK government and David Cameron, Lord Cameron in particular, the Foreign Secretary, who has been increasingly vocal in all sorts of ways about what's happening in Gaza. He was answering questions in the House of Lords this afternoon. This is what he had to say.
You've got to get, in our view, the Hamas leaders out of Gaza. Otherwise, any ceasefire won't last because the problem will still be there. You've got to dismantle the operation of terrorist attacks. You've got to have a new Palestinian Authority government in place. You've got to give the Palestinian people a political horizon to a better future and a two-state solution. And crucially, you've got to release all of the hostages and do that.
So we've already heard the UN say it will not participate in any forced evacuation of Rafah. They are coming down firmly on the side of the civilians who have been moved one too many times already. South Africa this afternoon has made an urgent request to the UN International Court. This is the court that handed down a judgment 2 Fridays ago to consider using its powers to intervene in Rafah. And last night we heard the EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell look at the source of the incursion, which was the funding of weapons to Israel.
Let's be logical. How many times have you heard the most prominent leaders and foreign ministers around the world saying too many people are being killed? President Biden said this is too much on the top. It's not proportional. Well, if you believe that too many people are being killed, maybe you should provide less arms in order to prevent so many people being killed.
Well, joining us now is The Economist's defence editor, Shashank Joshi. Shashank, it sounds as if the UN are now saying they will not participate in any forced evacuation of Rafah. We've heard what sounds like a growing voice from world leaders telling Netanyahu to back off, and yet everyone is still fearing the worst in Rafah with this impending offensive.
They are, and that Israeli hostage raid that rescued a couple of hostages a few days ago may have brought Netanyahu a little bit of extra time. He can paint that as a success. He can say that, look, we don't need to do a big offensive. We can conduct small-scale operations. But I suspect, precisely because Rafah is now the last major stronghold for Hamas, that it's going to be very difficult to discourage this government from actually going in force. And even if they judge that it causes a complete rupture in ties with the United States, they might judge that the military benefit to going after Hamas in that last stand could be worth the diplomatic cost and the backlash that will inevitably ensue, particularly, I think, in this case, given Rafah's geography from Egypt, which has to be taken very seriously.
Shashank, is there anything that the US administration, the Biden administration, could do at this point that could deter them? Or has Netanyahu, do you think, decided and there is no deterrence?
I think that there's lots of leverage. The only question is whether the Biden administration is willing to use it. It's been fairly limited so far. The most obvious leverage, of course, is that the United States is still providing a substantial number of weapons to the Israel Defense Forces. Now, they have a large stockpile. It's not as if the Americans can cut them off and they are no longer able to advance the next day. But for the IDF's perspective, they have to look at not just Gaza, but also the prospect of a potential conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon and other theatres, including escalation in the West Bank and with Iran. And so they won't want to be in a situation where they are completely devoid of that American security umbrella, the protection of American warships in the Mediterranean, American precision bombs coming in to restock their arsenal. So I think that leverage is, of course, the big lever that Biden could still pull, but doing so would be deeply politically contentious in the United States, not least in an election year. So I think the White House will be quite conflicted here.
We heard the EU spokesman very vocal last night saying if you want to see fewer deaths, give them fewer weapons. Just bring us up to date with the difference in approach then. So the EU has banned the sale of weapons to Israel, is that right?
No, it hasn't. And here, actually, it was important to understand Joseph Borrell, he's effectively the EU's foreign minister, but he doesn't really have all that much authority himself. You know, as we all know, I think our listeners know, it's the member states in the European Union that tend to have most of the authority for these kinds of things. The EU can introduce sanctions, but as we have seen in time after time, and in case of Russia, the obstacles from Viktor Orban and others, they need consensus. They need consensus of all the member states. And I think you'd have a number of them, some countries like Germany that see a historical obligation to Israel, they would be very wary of any kind of blanket cutoff. So far, I think we've seen Denmark, for instance, say they will ban certain parts for F-35s from their soil. But overall, the EU simply isn't a huge provider of critical arms and ammunition to Israel at this time. This is going to have to be a US call.
Shashank, why is it? Can you just give our listeners a sense of why it is and why it would be that an incursion or assault on Rafah in particular would be so devastating, and why the US and Lord Cameron and the EU, British government, is so concerned about it?
Well, Rafah is a small border city in the south of Gaza, and its population is somewhere in the region of 300,000 100,000. I'm trying to think of, what UK city I would compare that to. We're talking Milton Keynes, for example, or sort of maybe Sunderland, somewhere like that. What it now has, because of the fighting in the rest of Gaza, is a population of about 1.3 million civilians. That's over half the population of the Gaza Strip that have crowded into that. So imagine that number of people crowding into Milton Keynes or somewhere of that size. And the humanitarian situation is obviously dire. Egypt is particularly concerned that a serious bout of fighting in Rafah would push people into the Sinai Peninsula, into Egypt on the other side. That's of profound concern to Egypt. They don't want to see that kind of displacement or be party to it. And there really aren't all that many other places for these people to go, given that the north, whilst much more stable than it was, is certainly not functioning in terms of hospital provision, electricity, food, fuel. All of that stuff is missing from the north at scale.
And why is Netanyahu and the Israeli government so determined to prosecute this, to do it, despite the opposition?
Well, of course, after October 7th and the Hamas atrocities, we saw the Israeli government committed itself to the destruction of Hamas. Hamas is very far from destroyed. They haven't killed any of the three major leaders. They've killed a lot of its foot soldiers, but the group is still fighting. It still exists. It's still reasserting itself in parts of the north that have been ostensibly cleared and stabilized. And for Benjamin Netanyahu himself, of course, he's ideologically committed to this, and politically his own survival hangs by the balance here. He knows that when the war calms down, when it quietens down, his own political future is at risk because his political stature in Israel has fallen so low. He has so many enemies that he would really be thrown out of office very fast indeed. So I think he's got to sort of take a pretty tough approach to this. Having said that, I will just point out that other plausible Israeli leaders, including people like General Benny Gantz, the former head of the IDF who's in the war cabinet, it's not impossible to imagine they too would also be pushing quite a hawkish line on pursuing Hamas into Rafah, given that they too want to see Hamas destroyed.
I mean, the idea that the Biden administration, the Jordanians, are still trying to work out a ceasefire right at the same time kind of gives you whiplash on this, doesn't it? I mean, are we at a place where they could be drawing up the details for a ceasefire whilst Netanyahu is still pursuing a ground invasion in Rafah itself?
I'd say that's what's happening right now.
Yeah.
At this point in time, if you look, as we talk, actually, I think there's talks going on in Cairo between Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, who's meeting with the head of Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, a man called David Barnea, along with the Prime Minister of Qatar, Egyptian officials. They are hammering out a ceasefire deal that at the current iteration is supposed to pause the fighting for 6 weeks, free the remaining hostages, and of course Hamas is pushing for a permanent ceasefire. Israel is saying they're not going to do that. But right now, the Americans are frustrated because they see Arab countries really supportive of this deal, willing to offer quite a lot to Israel in the form of concessions, diplomatic recognition, if Israel commits to a two-state solution as well. But they see Netanyahu as being pretty rejectionist about this, adamant that he wants to conduct military operations and adamant that he will do that over and above the immediate possibility of getting the hostages out.
Really, really helpful to have that context from you. Shashank, thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks. So this morning we were awoken, roused from our slumbers by our little Antipodean friend once again.
Who is our little... Sounds like we know a little kangaroo or something who comes and wakes
do.
us up in the morning. I suppose we do in a way.
Hoppy Soapy.
Hoppy Soapy. Here's his latest dispatch from Australasia.
Just ahead of your editorial meeting this morning, can you please set the record straight on the podcast that I have not, would not, do not send voice messages asking to be on the episode every day? I'm very happy here in Australia. I'm very happy to be mixing with the kangaroos and koalas and the possums and poisonous spiders aplenty. So please stop it. Desist, Lewis Goodall and Emily Maitlis.
So that wasn't
Is he charging
a voice
for
note.
this stuff?
That wasn't a voice note or anything, was it?
No, of course not. No.
That he just said.
And he certainly didn't
Try and get
entirely
himself on the
unwelcome.
podcast.
No,
Right.
entirely uninvited. Turn up at the morning editorial meeting that he just cited. He didn't do that this morning, of course.
He was
as well.
spotted. I mean, to put this in context, and I think this is quite important, our political editor's friend was in a pool in Sydney Harbour where she spotted Speedo's Sopel swimming. And that was how she
He's
knew.
lucky he didn't get arrested.
I know, for swimming. And
Well,
as she was
arrest.
having her morning dip, or maybe evening dip, I can't work it out, we were having our morning meeting and he decided to join us.
Yes, this is LBC's Natasha Clark, whose friend spotted, the lesser spotted, the
It's
very
it's
spotted,
it's a small
Speedo
world,
Sopel.
isn't it? Yeah.
It's a small world, yeah.
I was listening, as I often do, to the podcast while I walked along the gorgeous eastern suburbs coastal walk here. Took a little break to have a quick swim in my favourite ocean pool. And who was I to spot there but your very own John Sopel, magnificently belly flopping into the pool, battling against the surf and looking mildly drowned.
Yeah, he was probably trying to get in touch with her to ask if he could appear on LBC or something.
Sure. I mean, as you can see, we miss him deeply.
We do miss him.
Or would if we were given the chance
I don't
to.
feel I miss him because I speak to him every day.
Exactly.
John,
Well,
I can't
all
wait
three
to
of us
speak.
be back tomorrow.
Yeah, John,
no
can't
doubt.
wait to speak to you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Say
Bye.
hello to the wife for us, who obviously has had a word.
And a great holiday.
A great holiday. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.